The 2025 Crankworx World Tour has been hosting events in Whistler this past week. So this event brings together the best mountain bike athletes from around the world to compete in elite level competitions. But with only a few days left, Crankworx has had to update their schedule to accommodate this Environment Canada rainfall warning that Steve was just mentioning. Some events have had to be rescheduled due to the rain. Up to 80 millimeters of rain could hit the higher elevations in that area today. And this comes at a time when a lot of events had been disrupted by extreme weather. In Newfoundland this week, for example, some of the volleyball games were postponed after a wildfire evacuation alert was issued. Shawna McKinley teaches at the British Columbia Institute of Technology, and she has just conducted a study into how often extreme weather disrupts events. Shawna, hi, good afternoon to you.
You as well. Thanks for having me, Gloria.
So your study mapped out the impact of extreme weather on global events and mass gatherings. So what did you find?
So essentially what we did was we amassed a sample of almost 2,100 events that had been disrupted over the last 20 years. And we wanted to be able to answer questions like what types of weather is most disruptive. We learned, for example, that globally storms are most disruptive, but the situation in Canada and in BC specifically is quite different, where we see wildfire and air quality causing a significant amount of concern, and flooding, which makes it not surprising why we're seeing the issues with Crankworx that we are this week in Whistler.
Yes, exactly. Well, where in the world did you monitor as part of your study?
So we looked at, the data is global, but most of our research, most of our data came from Canada, Australia, the United States, and the UK. So it's best indicative of those three countries. So storms in particular, very disruptive in the US. You think of the eastern seaboard, the hurricanes, the storm season they have there, the UK as well. But in Canada, the situation is different. We have storms in the east. We have and experience them with events in Alberta. Don't tend to see them as much of a driving force in BC, where we see wildfire and flooding having more influence.
Okay, and which events are most likely to be disrupted? What types of events?
Yeah, so we saw that globally arts, culture, and entertainment, so things like music festivals and concerts, bore the most disruption. But again, there's regional variation. And one of the things that we see in Canada that's different than the other three countries is that sporting events are quite impacted. They're still behind arts, culture, and entertainment, but it's a fairly significant portion. And fundraising events, which was quite a surprising finding that we didn't expect to see.
Okay, well, just can you tell us a little more about just how your study worked? I mean, just what specifically you were looking at.
Yeah, so essentially it's a wide-scale media monitoring project. So we looked at English language media, we looked at social media, we looked at meetings media, we also looked at information coming from emergency response and from destinations and from venues about the disruption that they were experiencing. And prior to the pandemic, we had to do that as an archive research project. So we're very cautious about what we say for those first 15 years or so. But in the post-pandemic period, and specifically since 2023, we've been doing live monitoring of these things on a global scale. So the work that we're seeing, or the information that we're seeing come in now from 2023 onward, we're able to start to look at possibly some trends around how the situation is changing.
Yeah, and well, different weather conditions represent different problems, right? Whether it's heat or wildfire smoke, that kind of needs a different solution than heavy rain or flooding or that type of thing. So what does your research show about the range of weather events that have caused problems?
What's interesting, one of the things that we started to see when we got into the data was the difference between those situations where a crowd isn't present at all. So we see in wildfire and in the case of extreme storms like hurricanes, people don't gather, mainly because there's travel bans and closures that prevent them from doing so. But in the case of heat and in the case of smoke, it's a bit more of a different situation. And in some respects, I think we're still learning how to moderate our behavior because some of these situations are a bit new and unprecedented in some regions. So we tend to gather more often, and therefore there tends to be more on-site health and safety concerns about things like heat stress or exposure to particulate matter. And that presents different requirements for event organizers to respond to.
Well, that's what. And what about those event organizers then? You know, what are you hearing in terms of the impact that this could have on event planning overall?
Yeah, I mean, as long as we've had events, we've had weather,
True.
so we've always been
True.
planning for it to an extent. And I think we're pretty well versed in a lot of the things that we're used to. And that's what's key, is because we have weather as a planning protocol, we consider it in a short-term way. We sort of take stock of it, maybe the month around our event, and then we plan accordingly. But when we start to think about this as an issue connected to climate change, the weather that we've had in the past isn't necessarily what we should be planning for in the future, or even what we're experiencing now. So it becomes really important to look at climate risk much earlier than we've had to, right in the very early decisions around things like siting and scheduling and budgeting for the event. So we need a much more holistic approach is the answer to that question than we've had up until now.
The 2010 Olympics come to mind when we had to cart in the snow for some of the local snow events, for example. It's like this, we hadn't planned for this. It's very mild this winter back when we were looking at that. But how can, event organizers actually anticipate these kinds of things? Extreme weather events, they're not predictable. You have to make plans far in advance. So what does that mean for, the actual planning process, do you think?
Well, I think what's really important is we look at it as a partnership, because often we have hosts that aren't where the event is. So you look at an organization like FIFA, right? Not necessarily aware of the finer details of Vancouver weather and how that could impact the World Cup. It requires destination managers and people who are hosting a lot of the local activities to prepare organizers for what to expect and to pay attention, again, not to what's happened in the past, but some of the climate projections that we have. For example, we have different cities across the country that have prepared climate plans and climate projections that should be better able to anticipate severe urban rainfall at unusual times of year and plan for it. They're familiar with things that we have in place around emergency preparedness for heat and alert systems and protocols around response to wildfire. So I think that destination host partnership is going to become even more critical.
Sure. Okay, and we're getting into just what this means for planning, what it means for global events. I mentioned the 2010 Olympics, but what should we be keeping in mind in the planning process for upcoming events like FIFA World Cup next year?
Well, I think that it's sort of a three-stage process. And with the FIFA World Cup, we already have a destination and a timing that's been set for the event. So that's where the first opportunity to consider this is, as I mentioned earlier. The next stage is making sure in those planning stages before the event happens that you are looking at your contracting and things like that to prepare suppliers for what might happen in the event of different contingencies, and not just thinking about what's going to happen in the event of heat, but what's going to happen in the event of heat and smoke and some of these compounding incidents. So setting up a lot of those, almost backcasting from what could happen to determine the contracts and the protocols and the training that you need and the equipment that you need to have in place to cope with the complexity of things that could occur. Because we know these events are in June and July, that we've had extreme heat events, we've had smoke events that have made events much more difficult, and often they're happening at the same time, which makes it more complex.
Well, really a pleasure to hear from you today. And thank you very much for taking us through some of your research.
Thanks, Gloria.
Especially on a rainy day where there's lots of event planners looking at alternate plans in light of the forecast for the weekend. So, Shawna, good to talk to you. That is Shawna McKinley, an instructor at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. She has just conducted a study about just how extreme weather events have affected scheduled events here at home and around the world.